Queen Camilla was left absolutely speechless after King Charles made his final decision about her palace access. But when you dig into what actually happened, the tabloid headlines are using one of the oldest tricks in the book, manufacturing a crisis where none exists. This is the real story behind the palace drama that's been sensationalized across social media. If you've seen this headline in the past few weeks, you've encountered what has become a masterclass in emotional manipulation disguised as breaking news. The narrative is simple, punchy, and designed to make you feel something before you think anything. Queen Camilla is devastated. The king has made a shocking move. The palace is in turmoil. But none of those things are actually true, and understanding why is crucial to understanding how modern media manufactures outrage from administrative decisions. Let's start with what really happened. In late June 2026, during the annual Sovereign Grant Report briefing, Royal Finance official James Chalmers announced that King Charles and Queen Camilla have decided not to move into Buckingham Palace as their primary residence after the completion of its decade-long refurbishment project. This refurbishment, which began in April 2017 and is due to be completed in April 2027, has cost approximately 435 million euros, or roughly $500 million. The announcement was made during an official scheduled briefing. There was nothing dramatic about it. There was nothing unexpected about it. It was a bureaucratic announcement about a logistical decision delivered in a formal setting by a financial officer. The palace would continue to serve as the ceremonial and operational center of royal life, but it would no longer be the primary residential home of the monarch. Now, here's where the gap emerges between the statement and the headline. The actual decision and its reasoning are being obscured by a layer of sensationalism that bears almost no relationship to what was actually said. When Chalmers made the announcement, he was clear about the thinking behind it. He said, "After careful consideration and to greatly increase opportunities for public access, the King and Queen have decided not to adopt Buckingham Palace as a personal residence and will instead continue to use Clarence House as their London home." Note what he emphasizes: public access. The palace has served as the monarch's primary residence since 1837, a tradition spanning nearly 2 centuries. Breaking that tradition, making the palace available to the public in unprecedented ways, is significant, but it's not dramatic in the way tabloids prefer their news to be. It requires explanation. It requires understanding context. It requires readers to sit with complexity. And so instead we get Queen Camilla is speechless. This is where the manufacturing of narratives becomes particularly clear. The announcement was made during a formal financial briefing in bureaucratic language, with rational justifications provided. There was nothing sensational about the actual event. The sensationalization came afterward, in the translation of this announcement into headline language. The palace made a decision. The tabloid media transformed that decision into a personal crisis. These are 2 entirely different stories, and the gap between them tells you something profound about how contemporary media operates and what it prioritizes. The mechanics of this distortion are worth examining because they reveal how information gets transformed as it moves through modern media ecosystems. The core facts are neutral and institutional. A decision has been made about residential arrangements for the British royal family. The reasoning involves increased public access and a reconceptualization of what Buckingham Palace's role should be in contemporary Britain. The palace will remain a working headquarters. The King and Queen will retain access to private rooms for daytime rest and occasional overnight stays, but it will not be their home. Instead, they will continue living at Clarence House, their current London residence, which has served as their home since before King Charles became monarch. The psychology behind why certain headlines work and others don't reveals something interesting about human attention and emotional engagement. Our brains are wired to pay attention to threats, to conflict, to emotional stakes. When you encounter a headline suggesting that someone you've heard of has been upset or surprised, your attention activates in a way it doesn't for headlines about administrative decisions and policy changes. This is not a conscious choice. This is how our neurological systems have evolved. We are pattern-matching creatures, constantly scanning our environment for things that matter to us. What? Headline about institutional arrangements doesn't register as mattering. A headline about someone being upset registers as potentially mattering. And media outlets understand this deeply, which is why they consistently select emotional angles over factual accuracy. This is actually a straightforward policy decision that reflects how Charles envisions the monarchy should operate in the 21st century. He's chosen to prioritize public access to a taxpayer-funded national treasure over personal residential comfort. You might argue that's good leadership. You might argue that it's insufficient, but you'd be engaging with the actual decision. Whereas the sensationalized headline forces you into a completely different narrative, one where there are emotional stakes, where someone has won and someone has lost, where drama is happening behind palace walls and leaking out in carefully constructed sound bites. Clarence House itself is significant in this equation. It's where Charles lived for decades before becoming king. It's where he raised his children. It's where his memories are embedded in the physical space. For a person to choose to remain in a home that carries all of that history, rather than move into the iconic palace that has served as the royal residence for nearly 2 centuries, is actually a statement about what matters to him. It's not deprivation. It's not loss. It's choosing continuity over tradition, choosing a place with personal history over a place with institutional grandeur. The question of who benefits from this distortion is illuminating. Tabloids benefit because emotional headlines drive engagement far more effectively than explanatory ones. Social media algorithms benefit because divisive and emotionally charged content generates shares, comments, and arguments. Readers think they're being informed when they're actually being guided toward a predetermined emotional state. And the institutions being covered, in this case the royal family, benefit from the fact that most people encounter the sensationalized version of events rather than the actual version, which means actual criticisms of the decision can be drowned out by people arguing about something that didn't happen. Let's address what actually didn't happen, because that's where the headline becomes truly misleading. There is no evidence that Queen Camilla was left speechless. No sources report that she had any particular emotional reaction to this decision. No palace insiders leaked stories about her being devastated or shocked. This is pure invention, a projection of a narrative onto a person because it serves the story the headline needs to tell. It's creating emotion where none has been documented because creating emotion is more effective than conveying information. It's manufacturing a personal drama to obscure an institutional decision. And regarding her palace access, she hasn't lost access to anything. The decision specifically preserves her ability to use private rooms within Buckingham Palace. The palace spokesperson confirmed this. Their Majesties will have access to private rooms within the palace where they can retire during the course of a working day, and which could be utilized as potential residential accommodation in times ahead. She will continue to use these rooms during official engagements and state visits. She will continue to have a place in the palace. What she won't have is a permanent bedroom there. What the palace won't be is her primary address. But in the way sensationalized headlines work, losing one thing, the primary residence arrangement that has existed for nearly 2 centuries, gets compressed and distorted into losing something else entirely. Access, presence, status, voice, relevance. This pattern of distortion is important to recognize because it repeats across nearly all tabloid coverage of high-profile figures and institutions. Take a neutral decision, find the smallest possible emotional angle, invent details to support that angle, and present it as fact. Repeat across multiple outlets. Watch it spread through social media as people engage with the emotion before they encounter the facts. By the time the facts arrive, the emotional narrative is already entrenched, and the facts seem like damage control rather than clarification. The architecture of social media platforms makes this spread exponentially more efficient than print journalism. A sensationalized headline can reach millions of people within hours, amplified by algorithms that reward engagement. When someone shares an emotional headline and argues about it in comments, the algorithm interprets that as the headline being valuable. So the algorithm boosts it further. More people see it, more people engage. The emotional narrative spreads exponentially, creating a reality effect where it seems like this is what everyone believes happened. The actual context of this decision is substantial. The renovation of Buckingham Palace has been the subject of considerable scrutiny and criticism. Nearly $500 million spent on a palace where the monarch doesn't live is easy to mock, easy to critique, easy to frame as excessive. And these are legitimate criticisms. Graham Smith, from the anti-monarchy group Republic, expressed precisely this sentiment when the decision was announced. He criticized the nearly €500 million investment in a palace the king does not intend to use as a residence, and demanded that it be fully open to the public year-round. This is a substantive political critique. The Crown is spending vast public resources on a building that will no longer serve its original purpose as the monarch's primary home. Yet it's being renovated to royal standards that most of the public can never afford. That's a reasonable conversation to have. But that conversation is essentially absent from the sensationalized coverage. Instead of engaging with the real critique, we get emotional narratives about palace access and devastating decisions and royal family drama. This serves multiple interests simultaneously. It serves the tabloids because it's more engaging. It serves the royals because it drowns out the substantive critique under a layer of invented personal drama that they can then dismiss as tabloid nonsense. Everyone benefits except the person trying to understand what actually happened and why it matters. To understand what's actually at stake in this decision, you need to understand the history of Buckingham Palace and what role it plays in the British state. The palace has served as the official residence of the British monarch since 1837, when it became Queen Victoria's primary home. Before that, it had various uses, various residents, various purposes, but for nearly 2 centuries, it has been the place where the monarch lives. It is simultaneously a private home and a public institution. Parts of it are closed to the public, reserved for the royal family. Other parts are open for public tours. The staterooms serve as backdrops for official functions. The private quarters are where the family actually lives. What King Charles has decided to do is fundamentally reorganize that relationship. Buckingham Palace will no longer be a place where the monarch lives. It will be a place where the monarch works. The 775 rooms of the palace will function as an administrative headquarters, a ceremonial center, a working institution. The private residential space that has defined it for nearly 2 centuries will be removed from the equation. Instead, the royal family will live at Clarence House, which is nearby but separate, private but adjacent to the institutional center of power. This is a significant departure from tradition, but it's not an unprecedented one. As the royal family has grown, as demands on the monarchy have changed, as security and infrastructure needs have evolved, different monarchs have made different residential choices. What makes Charles's decision distinctive is not that it's surprising, but that it's a deliberate choice to prioritize public access and public benefit over private residential comfort. It's a statement about what the monarchy should be in the 21st century. Now, why would the sensationalized media distort this into a story about Queen Camilla being speechless? Because the actual story requires explanation and context. Because the actual story involves understanding institutional history and contemporary policy debates. Because the actual story doesn't have a clear villain and a clear victim, which is the template most tabloid coverage requires. But if you invent a personal angle, if you suggest that someone has been devastated by this decision, if you imply that there's conflict and drama happening behind closed doors, then suddenly you have a story that people will engage with emotionally before they think about it rationally. The mechanics of this distortion have become more sophisticated as digital media has evolved. In previous eras, sensationalized coverage was contained within tabloid publications and circulated within certain demographics. Now, sensationalized headlines circulate through social media, where they're amplified by algorithms that reward engagement. A headline that makes people angry or upset will be shared more frequently, boosted by algorithms, and encountered by far more people than a headline that explains context. By the time the actual facts circulate, the emotional narrative is already embedded in people's minds. Narrative? Are specific details being omitted that would complicate the story? Are quotes being taken out of context or paraphrased in ways that shift their meaning? Are emotional descriptors being applied without factual support? When you encounter a headline like Queen Camilla speechless, after Charles confirms final decision about her palace access, all of these red flags should immediately activate. Let's look at what the palace actually said about this decision to understand what's not being sensationalized. The official statement from Buckingham Palace read, "After careful consideration, and to greatly increase opportunities for public access, the King and Queen have decided not to adopt Buckingham Palace as a personal residence, and will instead continue to use Clarence House as their London home. Their Majesties will, however, have access to private rooms within the palace where they can retire during the course of a working day, and which could be utilized as potential residential accommodation in times ahead. This is both a change from the past and a recognition of the future. In all other ways, Buckingham Palace will continue to be both the ceremonial and operational center of royal life." The language in this statement is carefully chosen, and understanding what each phrase does reveals the actual thinking behind the decision. After careful consideration signals that this wasn't impulsive, this was thought through. And to greatly increase opportunities for public access places public benefit at the center of the reasoning. This is not about personal preference, this is about institutional purpose. Not adopt as a personal residence is precise language. They're not being prohibited from using the palace, they're making a choice not to establish it as their primary home. Continue to use Clarence House emphasizes continuity, not change. They're not losing something, they're maintaining what they already have. Private rooms, where they can retire, acknowledges that they retain access to the palace for personal use. They can rest there during workdays. They can stay overnight if needed. But the palace's primary function will no longer be residential. Notice what's missing. Any reference to Queen Camilla being speechless, upset, or devastated. Notice what's absent. Drama, conflict, surprise. What's present is thoughtful language about institutional purpose and public benefit. This is administrative language, not emotional upheaval. Yet the sensationalized coverage translates this into personal drama because drama sells. The palace spokesperson further clarified the reasoning. "It will remain a working home, but we are seeking to widen public access precisely to maximize the national benefit of a publicly funded building." This statement is interesting because it reframes what the palace actually is. It's not primarily a residence, it's a working institution. It's publicly funded. The public benefit is a central consideration in how it should be used. Therefore, if keeping it as a private residence limits public access, and not using it as a private residence increases public access, then not using it as a private residence is the better choice. This is a coherent argument about institutional resource allocation. It's not dramatic, but it's logical. And regarding King Charles himself, the palace confirmed, His Majesty retains huge affection for Buckingham Palace and a deep respect for its role in royal and public life. He loves the palace. He respects what it represents. He's choosing not to live there because he thinks serving the public is more important than personal comfort. You could see this as noble, you could see this as performative, you could see this as both, but you can't see it as devastating to Queen Camilla unless you invent an emotional response that she hasn't expressed. The refurbishment itself provides important context for understanding why this decision came up at this particular moment. The palace has been under renovation since April 2017, nearly a decade of construction and restoration work. The project has replaced aging electrical wiring, obsolete boilers, and other essential infrastructure that has accumulated deterioration over more than a century of use. Modern upgrades have been added, including electric vehicle charging points across the estate. The work is extensive and expensive precisely because maintaining a 775-room palace built in different eras with different technologies is genuinely difficult. By the time the refurbishment is complete in April 2027, the palace will be a thoroughly modern facility with historical integrity maintained. Understanding the scope of this work helps clarify why the cost is so substantial. Buckingham Palace isn't a single building. It's essentially an enormous estate with 775 rooms, 52 royal and guest bedrooms, 188 staff bedrooms, 92 offices, and 78 bathrooms. It houses thousands of miles of electrical wiring, heating systems, plumbing infrastructure, and other systems that have been added and modified over centuries. Some of the wiring dated back to the 19th century. Some of the boilers were from the early 20th century. Replacing this infrastructure while preserving the historical character of the rooms is not simple. It requires specialized workers, careful planning, and immense coordination. The nearly $500 million cost, when distributed across a decade-long project on a building of this scale and complexity, is actually reasonable by standards of major heritage restoration projects worldwide. One particularly interesting aspect of the refurbishment is the creation of the Consort's Library, which will transform 3 historic rooms in the North Wing into a new space. This library will honor Prince Albert, Queen Alexandra, the late Prince Philip, and Queen Camilla. It will serve as an official audience room for the Queen, support educational initiatives, and become a feature on public tours of Buckingham Palace. This is significant because it's a way of modernizing the palace's function while honoring those who have held the role of Queen Consort. It's institutional adaptation, not diminishment. Yet this detail is absent from sensationalized coverage, which would rather imply that Camilla has lost something rather than acknowledge that new roles and spaces are being created for her. The Consort's Library is particularly revealing about what the palace decision means. The palace is creating a dedicated space for Queen Camilla with an official audience room where she can conduct duties. This is not diminishing someone's role. A space that bears her name, honors her contributions, and will be part of public tours seen by thousands annually is not a loss. It's a modernization of how the Queen Consort role is recognized within the institutional structure. The broader context of royal finances also matters for understanding this decision. In June 2026, the same briefing where this decision was announced, King Charles became the first British monarch to publicly disclose the amount of tax he pays. He released a summary showing that he pays income tax on his private income, though the tax experts about what should and shouldn't be included. This willingness to engage with transparency about royal finances suggests that the decision about Buckingham Palace is part of a broader effort to make the monarchy more transparent, more accountable, and more aligned with contemporary expectations about how public institutions should operate. However, this is also where legitimate criticism becomes possible. Tax expert Dan Neidl called the disclosure a sideshow, noting that the real figures cannot be fully verified and that the boundary between personal and crown assets remains unclear. Graham Smith from Republic made similar points, arguing that genuine transparency requires understanding exactly what the crown owns and how it's funded. These are substantive criticisms of the monarch's approach to financial transparency and accountability, but they're also criticisms that require some understanding of tax policy, asset accounting, and institutional structures. They're not engaging material for tabloid headlines, because they require explanation rather than emotion. What's particularly revealing about the sensationalized coverage is what it does with the fact that King Charles is willing to spend nearly $500 million on restoring a palace he's not going to live in. This is either a generous public commitment to historical preservation and public access, or it's an absurd waste of public funds on opulent infrastructure that serves no practical purpose. The sensationalized headline doesn't engage with either of these interpretations. Instead, it creates a false drama about palace access and personal devastation, which allows both the institution and the critics to ignore each other with the tabloid coverage functioning as white noise in the middle. This pattern repeats when you examine other recent royal stories covered with sensationalism. Any genuine development involving the royal family gets overlaid with emotional narratives, invented personal conflicts, and dramatized stakes. The effect is to make it impossible to have a serious conversation about what the monarchy is, what it should be, and whether current arrangements serve the public interest. Instead, we get endless cycles of emotional stories that distort the institutional reality beneath them. The question of what will happen under future monarchs is also left unexamined by sensationalized coverage. As the palace notes, this arrangement is what King Charles and Queen Camilla have decided. It remains to be seen what happens when King William becomes monarch. He might reverse this decision. He might maintain it. He might modify it further. This is a genuine question about the future of the monarchy and what role Buckingham Palace will play. But sensationalized coverage doesn't engage with questions about the future because they require speculation and nuance, neither of which drive engagement the way emotional narratives do. For Queen Camilla, this decision changes very little practically. She's lived at Clarence House for decades. Her daily life isn't structured around Buckingham Palace. The palace functions as her workplace and ceremonial space. What's changed is that officially it will no longer be her primary residence. The palace will be designed as a public institution first and private home second. This is an administrative change, not personal. And yet the sensationalized headline suggests the opposite. It suggests that something deeply personal has happened, that her status has been affected, that her voice has been diminished. None of these things are true. What's actually true is that a decision has been made about how a building will be used, and a decision has been made to prioritize public access over private residential space. This is a policy choice, not a personal rejection. Understanding how sensationalized coverage works, understanding the difference between the emotional narrative and the factual reality, understanding how distortion serves multiple interests simultaneously, these are increasingly essential skills for consuming media responsibly. You cannot trust headlines to tell you what actually happened. You have to dig deeper, you have to find the original statements, you have to understand the institutional context. You have to recognize the signature moves of tabloid distortion and train yourself to notice when they're being deployed. In this case, the real story is about a significant shift in how the British monarchy understands its role and its relationship to public resources. It's about a deliberate choice to prioritize institutional purpose over personal comfort. It's about transparency and accountability, though not without legitimate criticism about how complete that transparency actually is. It's about palace, infrastructure and historical preservation and public access, and contemporary political debates about whether the monarchy should exist at all and what form it should take if it does. These are real stories worth engaging with, but they're invisible beneath the sensationalized narrative about Queen Camilla being speechless. The sensationalization of this story reveals something crucial about contemporary media. Our need for emotional engagement has outpaced our need for factual accuracy. We would rather have a false story that makes us feel something than a true story that requires us to think about complexity. And media outlets profit enormously from this preference, because emotional content drives engagement, and engagement drives revenue. The cost of this arrangement is borne by everyone who encounters the false narrative first and the truth second, if at all. For content creators, for people trying to build audiences and drive engagement, the lesson is clear. Sensationalize everything. Invent emotion where none exists. Create false conflicts. Distort institutional decisions into personal dramas. The formula works. People engage with it. It spreads through social media. It becomes what people believe happened. The truth, when it finally arrives, is too late to matter. By then, the false narrative is entrenched and the truth is dismissed as damage control or institution-serving spin. This is why critical media literacy is not a luxury skill, but a necessary one. When you encounter a headline like Queen Camilla speechless after Charles confirms final decision about her palace access, you should immediately ask, who benefits from this narrative? What details are missing that would complicate the story? What would the palace refurbishment will be completed in April 2027. Buckingham Palace will continue to function as the ceremonial and operational center of royal life. The 775 rooms will be preserved and maintained. The public will have expanded access to the spaces that have historically been closed to them. King Charles and Queen Camilla will continue living at Clarence House. And somewhere, a tabloid headline will manufacture a false crisis around these neutral facts, and millions of people will encounter that headline before they encounter the truth. This is how modern media works. Understanding it is the only defense against being manipulated by it.